Hello, and welcome to this lecture entitled Redemption and Bourbonism in Alabama. This lecture covers the era 1874 through about 1903, the 29 years from the Redeemers' overthrow of Alabama's Reconstruction government to the first year that Alabama's 1901 Constitution took effect. The question that ties this era together is this: how did the Bourbon Redeemer government of Alabama reconcile its reactionary desire to reinstate the antebellum government with the pressures of the post-bellum New South? We'll look at some of the ways the Bourbons tried to do this. We'll cover these topics. First, I'll define redemption and Bourbonism. We'll look at the election of 1874 and the Constitution of 1875, the so-called Redeemer Constitution. Then we'll look at state policies under the Redeemers, finance and strict economy, agricultural and industrial policies, educational policies, penal system policies, and social welfare policies. Let's begin by defining redemption, quote unquote, and Bourbonism. Redemption, accomplished by the Redeemers, was the victory of the Democratic Party, composed of many former Confederates and calling themselves the Conservative Democratic Party, over the Republican-dominated Alabama government in 1874. The Redeemers ran on an explicitly white supremacist program. That and promising to shrink government until it couldn't function was pretty much the entire platform. In the 1870 election, these conservative Democrats had won the governorship and the Alabama House of Representatives, but Republicans retained the Senate and many other state offices. But what do the labels Bourbon, Bourbonism, and Bourbon democracy have to do with this era? These labels were applied to the conservative Democratic Redeemers by their enemies, and the title has little to do with the potent liquor of that name, but it has much to do with a quip made by the French politician Talleyrand after Napoleon fell in 1815. When Louis XVIII returned to the throne of France and vowed to re-implement France before the Revolution, Talleyrand said of him and his royal house, the Bourbons, that they had learned nothing and yet had forgotten nothing. The Redeemers' enemies thought the same of them, and that they wanted to ignore the enormous changes wrought by the Civil War, wrought by emancipation, and wanted to return to the Old South as much as possible. Alan J. Going published his foundational study of this period in 1851, entitled Bourbon Democracy in Alabama, 1874 to 1890. Much of this lecture relies on Going's work. As I said, the conservative Democrats, and both of these are capitalized, okay? That's the party name, Conservative Democratic Party. The conservative Democrats ran on white supremacy and, by the way, lowering state expenditures, but even that, the lowering of state expenditures, was couched in racial overtones. The Democrats won the 1874 election for governor, most state offices, and both houses of the legislature, so they had absolutely unbridled reign to do almost nothing. That is, the Redeemers had almost no vision of what Alabama could be in its future or how to get there. They were mostly concerned with controlling African Americans and with low taxes. Whatever policies they had going forward were in service of short-term goals. You see this list of Bourbon governors before you. The first was George S. Houston from Lauderdale County. He's the namesake of the youngest of Alabama's 67 counties, Houston County, directly across the state from Lauderdale in deep southeast Alabama, that was formed in 1903. After 1890, the Bourbon governors had to fend off the threat of agrarianism and populism, so their programs are slightly different from those of Houston, Cobb, O'Neill, and Say. In fact, Governor Johnston adopted many of the platform planks of the Alabama populists, though mostly in service of fighting against arch-conservative Democrat William C. Oates and countering the populist threat to the Democratic Party by co-opting their ideas. The mechanism by which the Redeemers held sway was the Constitution of 1875. Interestingly, although their avowed purpose was, as Going wrote, the overthrow of radicalism, quote unquote, they kept many of the provisions of the Reconstruction Constitution of 1868, but with a couple of important changes that withdrew government from the economy. Let's look at what the Bourbons did, at least until 1890, when the populists threatened the Democrats' hegemony. The first of the Redeemers' great projects was to adjust the state debt, which had risen to as much as $30 million, which was a huge sum at that time. Although the Redeemers and most white people blamed the Reconstruction legislature for profligacy and outright theft, most of that debt came from ordinary government expenditures, including especially expanded services like education to black people. And it was also these services in a time of severe war-caused deflation and a ruined tax base. Another significant cause of the state debt was that the legislature had backed the bonds of multiple railroad companies. This meant that if the railroads went bankrupt, the legislature was on the hook to the bondholders. Most of these railroads, surprisingly, did go bankrupt, and many of them did so because their owners stole all the money. Then, in 1873, a financial panic set in that finished off the struggling railroad companies in Alabama and led to another round of long-term deflation throughout the United States. When the Redeemer legislature met to deal with the bonded indebtedness problem, bondholders, mostly in New York and London, feared that they would simply repudiate the debt, that is, refuse to pay any of it. That's a big step, and it hits the state's future creditworthiness hard. Let me give you an example. In 1835, Mississippi repudiated its state debt, and even today, almost 200 years later, it has to pay a higher interest rate because its bonds remain downgraded from that event. The Alabama legislature created a committee in 1875 to make a plan for the debt. Rather than repudiate, the commission simply refused to recognize almost all of the railroad bonds as legitimate state debt, and it refused to recognize some other outstanding obligations. It recognized only the bonds of the Alabama and Chattanooga Railroad as legitimate, and then only because the state had taken over the railroad during its railroad's descent into bankruptcy. This reduced the debt eventually to $12.5 million. The bondholders were livid about taking such a significant haircut, though the English bankers received 500,000 acres of state land in lieu of cash. Allen Going wrote, quote, Alabama preserved its public credit standing and brought its obligations down to a reasonable level, unquote. That's on page 77. To satisfy their campaign rhetoric and their natural inclination to reduce government far enough that it could not provide services to the powerless, as well as to pay the interest on the remaining debt, the Redeemers practiced what they called, quote unquote, strict economy in governmental affairs. One of their first acts was to eliminate a number of state offices that the Reconstruction legislature had created, like the office of lieutenant governor. The president pro tem of the Senate became next in line for the governorship. Next, the Redeemers reduced state salaries across the board by about 1/4. This had the effect of allowing only independently wealthy men, generally, to accept government jobs. On the other hand, when the Redeemer legislatures wanted it, they created new offices and paid others fairly well. For example, they created the office of prison warden, railroad commissioner, and agricultural commissioner while raising the salaries of many other offices over time. Another money-saving initiative was to change the legislature from meeting every year to meeting every other year. The Redeemers wanted to keep taxes as low as possible, too. Real property, land, was the basis for almost all taxation in Alabama. There was some personal property tax, poll tax, that's a tax per person, and some other taxes. But property taxes were the main generator of state funds. And we express property taxes as a thing called millage. 1 mill is $1 per $1,000 of property's assessed value. The Constitution of 1875 set the maximum tax rate at 7.5 mills, $7.50 for every $1,000 of a property's assessed value. The legislature reduced this over time until it reached 6.5 mills in 1883. This, combined with low assessments and lax enforcement, provided insufficient funds for Alabama's government to run on. But one person did run, and this one person made something of a mockery of the charges that the Reconstruction legislatures were a nest of thieves. This was State Treasurer Isaac Vincent, who ran after he embezzled $231,000 of state funds in 1883. That's the equivalent to $7.3 million in 2023. He was never apprehended, but the state only recovered about $73,000 from seizing his Alabama property and from suing the people who signed his performance bond. Alabama faced almost insurmountable problems in its agriculture. The Civil War, particularly emancipation, had, as cruel as this sounds, eliminated a resource that planters used in the credit market. With the enslaved being free, credit came to a halt. In addition, the freed people acted freely. That is, they moved about and refused to work at demeaning or underpaid farm labor. And they worked the system to their advantage just as white planters and white yeoman farmers did. So Redeemer legislatures were faced with three big problems: taxation, farm credit, and controlling farm labor. Now, true to form, they created a taxation exemption system that allowed large landowners to exempt as much as $5,000 of property from taxation, both real and personal, but made it difficult for small farmers and sharecroppers to exempt the legal maximum of $500 of their property. So taxation exemptions favored the wealthy. The entire state was starved for credit. One mechanism to create homegrown small farmer credit was the merchant crop lien. This meant that farmers could borrow money for supplies, called furnish, from local merchants. In the early Redeemer years, getting credit on merchants' books meant that the farmer could move around and earn money, cash money, to repay from other work, even if they put their crops up for collateral. This system set landowners against merchants, especially when acts of 1876 and 1878 made merchant liens superior to land rent liens. That is, the merchants got paid first, and maybe the crops brought in enough to pay land rent. Landlords convinced the legislature this was unwise, especially if it was important to control black labor by tying blacks to the land. So in 1884 and 1887, the legislature abolished merchant liens in almost all counties. Then in 1889, it legalized mortgaging unplanted crops, thereby putting croppers and tenants directly under the control of planters. Sharecropping had arisen during the first years of Reconstruction as a means of getting labor on the farms and as a way for black farmers without money to work their own plots under their own discipline. But the merchant liens allowed black farmers to move around, and they often skipped out on debts or worked at wage labor to supplement their farm income. Poor white farmers did exactly the same thing. Planters, as we've seen, plugged this by switching land rent liens, often paid in crops, not cash, for merchant liens. But they also encouraged white migration to replace black workers. This failed. So the state imposed draconian laws and penalties on activities that, while sometimes criminal, were always overpunished. For example, agricultural theft, usually of harvested cotton or farm animals, drew severe sentences in the state penitentiary. To prevent local croppers from fleeing for a better life, Alabama imposed high fees on anyone who acted as a labor recruiter with the promise of jobs and with railroad tickets for workers to leave the state. In 1885, an act made breaking a labor contract, usually a sharecropping contract for an entire year, which was common, or enticing someone to break such a contract into a felony. This was moderated by having to prove intentional fraud, but that provision eroded over time. Probably the most important labor control laws were the vagrancy statutes. This often applied to farm laborers who floated into cities to pick up work during the lay-by when work on the farm was slack. Few laborers applied for a job like we do today. Rather, they did a daily shape-up, as it was called, at a factory or similar workplace gate to do day labor. If they weren't chosen to work, or if their money ran out, they hung out in town and became subject to arrest and long sentences doing labor for the county. Vagrancy laws were designed to keep laborers either on the farm or in jail. Farmers of all sizes wanted better roads, and this was something the Redeemer legislatures were unable to help with. The Constitution of 1875 prohibited state money going to internal improvements, like roads, and since before statehood, road making was the province of county governments. Unable to pay, the state did strengthen the so-called statute labor system by which farmers paid their land taxes, not in cash, but in up to 10 days per year working on the roads in their district. State law set up county road districts with supervisors who called out all the men between 18 and 45 years of age, and they would repair dirt roads in their district for a few days. No one liked this system, except when the alternative became paying taxes in cash. Farmers treated the road work like an extension of their field work, which really it was. They used human and animal power to plow and shape the road beds and the road surfaces. They tossed the muck from the drainage ditches back onto the center of the road bed and then shape all of that. Roads also, you can't think of roads as like we do today, as going from one place to another. What they did was to go out into the countryside for 5 or 8 miles from rail hubs or from riverboat ports. Again, they're not the long distance roadways of today. They're farm to market roads. Let's look at industrial policy. The industrial policy of the Redeemer was haphazard at best and driven by the immediate needs of whatever faction had power at the moment. One interesting aspect of the era was that many of the Redeemers were old Confederates living in the past and they opposed the rising form of concentrated capital, that is, corporations. Now, often we think of socialists who were arising with industrialization as opposing corporations and the corporate form. But these old mossbacks did the same thing, just from a completely different political point of view. Many of these mossbacks thought corporations put too much power into the hands of money men, and they thought of money as a tool, but as something not to be accumulated in great hordes. They were able to keep the legislature from limiting liability of stockholders. This meant that if a corporation failed, creditors could take everything from the stockholders and the debtors. Big Eastern and especially British corporations simply refused to do business in Alabama because of this. But the old Confederates ran into the New South men who were anxious for Alabama to join in the new economy, driven by gathering as much filthy lucre as possible. Not long after the Constitution of 1875 took effect, the legislature acquiesced and limited liability for corporate failure to only the stock that was owned by the investor. This, reported Alan Going, was the only piece of legislation that corporate lobbyists wanted. But other Alabamians wanted other things. Legislatures and state officials hounded the federal government to sell, for a fraction of its assessed value, thousands of acres of land it held in the state, that is, the feds held in the state. That land had become a federal trust dating back to territorial days through Native American removal, and had been supplemented by confiscation of abandoned lands after the Civil War. Birmingham area industrialists wanted the land at $1.25 an acre, which was the price set for agricultural land, rather than at the $20 to $30 per acre assessed value of those mineral lands. The industrialists wanted the mineral lands for $1.25 rather than for $20 to $30 per acre. State officials spent a good deal of energy on trying to convince the feds to sell for $1.25 an acre, and they had some success. Another state policy that affected both industry and agriculture was the encouragement of white immigration, which I've already mentioned. Alabama created a commissioner of immigration in the 1880s, but eventually those duties moved to the commissioner of agriculture. A fellow named Reuben Kolb, K-O-L-B, who made two unsuccessful runs for the governor as a populist, began his political career as that agricultural commissioner. And particularly, he pushed a spectacular, quote-unquote, Alabama on wheels tour of 1888. Reuben Kolb paid for a special train to tour Chicago and the upper Midwest in that year of 1888, propagandizing Alabama in hopes of attracting white farmers and factory workers. He failed as spectacularly as he showboated, though there were some residual effects that might be attributable to him. For example, in 1895, a number of Swedes from Indiana founded the town of Thorsby in central Alabama, and by the end of the decade, a group of utopian single taxers had founded Fairhope in Baldwin County. Some Central and Southern Europeans moved to Birmingham, particularly Italians, and by an odd circumstance, a group of Croatians who specialized in making barrel staves. The educational policy of the Redeemers centered on increasing discrimination and reducing public funding of schools. First, understand that the school system in Alabama, we're talking about almost entirely primary schools. Alabama did not have public high schools in a system until the 20th century. The Reconstruction Constitution of 1868 and the legislatures after the Civil War had added education for freed people, but had maintained segregated schools. They had created a centralized state system under a state board and tried but usually failed to provide state funds. Consequently, by 1874, because of this failure to provide state funds, the school system in Alabama was barely functioning. It was really kind of a wreck. Then in 1877, after so-called redemption, the Redeemer legislature reorganized the school system to return it to its antebellum roots. The 1877 school law did away with the state school board and made the superintendent elective. It took power away from county school superintendents and county school boards, then turned around and vested that power in the hands of township school trustees. Funding was always an issue. Alabama schools had multiple streams of funds: local taxes, poll taxes, state appropriations, 16th section funds, and direct gifts. That 1877 school law allowed state funds, such as they were, to go to schools that charged tuition, and it encouraged gifts, direct gifts, usually from wealthy local patrons to the schools. Tax collectors were also empowered by the 1877 law and by later laws to transfer local taxes directly to the school trustees rather than sending them to the state treasury to be dispersed by a different formula. And the 1875 Constitution set the maximum local tax rate so low that it became very difficult to fund schools. Some townships levied local school taxes, but in 1887, the Alabama Supreme Court ruled that only legally constituted municipalities could levy local taxes. Now, the workaround for these township school boards was to go to the legislature and get their school districts incorporated as municipalities. After 1890, the legislature created scores of these. One funding mechanism was the poll tax, a per-person tax of $1, and then it rose to $1.50 per year that went to fund schools. Every one of the incorporated school district laws after 1890 included a section that divided the poll taxes according to the race of the payer. Poll taxes from whites went to white schools. Poll taxes from blacks went to black schools. But the poll taxes were not mandatory, and cash-strapped blacks generally failed to pay. Thus, their children's schools were not particularly well funded. Same with poor whites relative to richer white districts. Under the Reconstruction Constitution and the Redeemer Constitution of 1875, school funds were to be distributed per capita by the race of the student. This was not well followed, and the legislature solved the inconsistencies in the school law of 1891 by allowing school boards to distribute funds as they saw fit, not necessarily, quote, for the equal benefit of the children, unquote. The Redeemer legislatures did keep the state normal school system alive. Okay, the previous Reconstruction legislatures had funded one normal school, that is 2 years of teacher training equivalent to upper high school and lower college, at Florence for whites, and 2 normal schools for blacks, one at Huntsville and one at Marion. In 1883, the Redeemers funded 2 new normal schools for whites at Jacksonville and Livingston, and in 1887, they funded a 4th at Troy. Let's back up to 1881. Booker T. Washington founded Tuskegee Institute that used the Redeemer law to receive public funds even though Tuskegee was a private school. In 1887, the State College for Negroes, as it was called, in Marion, moved to Montgomery, and then it went on to become Alabama State University today. Then, In 1891, the so-called Second Morrill Act provided funding to establish a black agricultural and mechanical institute like the first Morrill Act did for white schools. The school in Huntsville, the African-American school in Huntsville, beat out both Tuskegee and Alabama State for this designation and this money, and changed its name to Alabama A&M. It's now Alabama A&M University. Alabama had two universities for white students. No black school was designated as a university. That's the University of Alabama and Alabama Agricultural and Mechanical College at Auburn. Auburn had been taken over by the state in 1872 and received the state share of Morrill Act funds and to be an agricultural mechanical college, and later Hatch Act funds to create the agricultural experiment stations. Let's look now at the state's penal system. Alabama had established its prison in 1841 and operated it by leasing the entire facility and all of the prisoners to concessionaires who ran the prisons as factories. But in 1866, the legislature allowed prisoners to be leased, quote unquote, outside the walls. This is the beginning of the infamous convict lease system that lasted until 1928. One motivation for convict lease was the old infrastructure of the prison. But the larger motivation was the change in the racial makeup of the body of convicts. Before the Civil War, almost all inmates were white, and there were very few of them. By 1877, 91% of the inmates were black. This comes from Going's book on page 176. The state still maintained a prison and a prison farm because only 2/3 of the prisoners were fit enough to lease. 1/3 remained wards of the state itself. By 1874, the state realized leasing could provide income, not just defer costs. So they turned to leasing to fund state government as an income stream. By 1890, 30% of the state income derived from convict leasing. By 1911, 16% derived from convict leasing. And then in 1928, convict leasing was abolished only after a 1927 gasoline tax replaced all of the income from convict leasing. Going back to 1881, John H. Bankhead became the warden of the prison and wrote an important report in 1883 that altered the way the prison operated. He wanted a board of convict inspectors to supervise the leasers to make sure conditions were acceptable, and he wanted county prisoner lease to fall under state inspection. The legislature gave him that and did him one better. It simply abolished his office in 1885 and put the entire system under the Board of Inspectors. Now, Bankhead did okay. He went on to become an important U.S. senator in the 20th century. Leasing, convict leasing, changed also. The Convict Lease Law of 1883 limited the number of convicts leased to a single contractor to a maximum of 200. But the 1886 law removed that maximum and flipped it over, imposed a minimum lease of 100 convicts. That meant you couldn't go as a small minor and get 10 convicts. You had to lease 100 convicts. This specifically benefited the Pratt Coal Company and its successor, Tennessee Iron, Coal, and Railroad Company, which we call TCI. By 1890, TCI leased 71% of Alabama prisoners for its coal mine. That is, 801 convicts of 1,123 in that year. Counties leased their prisoners also. Counties kept all prisoners whose sentences were 2 years or less and made money by leasing them to individuals and local companies. The abuses of prisoners were what you'd expect: abysmal living conditions, excessive punishment that included whippings, and a scandal in 1926 in which a young convict was whipped to death encouraged abolishment of convict lease. But the worst abuse was that convicts and prisoners simply got lost in the system, so that many were kept for months and even years beyond their release date. The last Redeemer policies we'll discuss are social welfare policies, also plagued by poor infrastructure and ideology favoring small, diffused, and ineffectual government and poor funding. Alabama's poor laws were a case in point. The Reconstruction legislature, before 1874, made support for the destitute a state fiscal responsibility, but the 1875 Redeemer Constitution moved that to the counties, all of which were both underfunded and tax limited. Another social welfare policy area was the Alabama Hospital for the Insane, founded by Dr. Peter Bryce in 1831 in Tuscaloosa, and it was a model for care at that time. The Redeemer's parsimony, however, starved that institution's work. For example, per patient weekly funding fell from $4 in 1878 to $2.15 in 1891. Even though the hospital had husbanded its funds and lobbied well enough to secure 2 new wings, demand for its services soon led to overcrowding that it never overcame. Black patients were also treated on the same campus, but in wooden houses away from the main building. That main building you see in the background of this slide. The State Institute for the Deaf and Blind was similar. It slipped under the radar for a few years and received the former Reconstruction appropriation of $24,000 per year, even though the Institute had maintained empty beds. But in 1879, the Redeemer legislature caught up and reduced its funding to $15,000. It too had enough surplus to build more space, but like the insane hospital, the State Institute for the Deaf and Blind was soon overcrowded and never recovered. Reorganization in 1887 led to a split between the deaf and blind schools, though they shared the same board of directors. And then in 1891, the legislature created a deaf and blind school for African Americans, also on that same Talladega campus. Public health became more professionalized, but the state let those responsibilities go to private concerns, the reconstituted Medical Association of the State of Alabama. In 1875, the Medical Association and its county affiliates became the public health office for the state. Its main job was to deal with yellow fever, which it did mostly in Mobile and mostly by quarantining ships, which of course merchants hated. In 1877, the Medical Association became the Physician Examination and Licensing Board, and in 1886, it gained responsibility for examining and licensing what was then called, and we call now, alternative medical providers. In that era, there was an existential battle between allopathic doctors and homeopathic doctors for procedural and ideological control of the entire medical profession in the entire United States. The Alabama Medical Association, or Medical Association of the State of Alabama, was allopaths, and in 1886 was given the right to examine homeopaths using the same exam as they gave to their own practitioners. Needless to say, they did more examining than they did licensing. As for pharmacists, the state actually took responsibility. The pharmacists had been fighting for licensure against small shop owners in small towns and in villages. So after a while, the state eventually created a 3-member exam board to license pharmacists in towns over 1,000 people. Lastly was the social welfare policy of Confederate pensions. Now, the U.S. government provided pensions to Union veterans, but obviously not to Confederate veterans. Southern states did, but they were very low, on the order of about $50 a year. They climbed during the more prosperous 1880s, and in 1887, the state expanded pensions to cover widows whose husbands had either died during the war or had died from war-related illness or injury. By 1890, Confederate pensions became a regular and rising expenditure of Alabama government, and in 1902, the state built the Confederate Soldiers' Home in Marbury. This operated until 1939 and is now Confederate Memorial Park right off of I-65 just north of Prattville. So allow me to summarize this lecture briefly. Beginning in 1874, former Confederates who dominated the Democratic Party in Alabama won the governorship, almost all state offices, and both houses of the legislature. In the words of historian Alan Going, they wanted to overthrow Alabama's Reconstruction government and return to the politics, racial system, and power relations that predated the Civil War. They called themselves the Conservative Democratic Party and claimed they had, quote unquote, redeemed Alabama's government from Republican and African-American misrule, and they ran on unabashed white supremacy. Recognizing that the so-called redeemers were all but unaware of the significant changes wrought by the Civil War and that they were wholly unprepared to meet the challenges of the New South, their enemies called them the Bourbons, after a quip by the French politician Talleyrand. The Bourbons wrote a new constitution in 1875 that was in force until 1903, and it both demonstrated their ideology and guided their attempts to accommodate that ideology with the realities of the New South. We saw the Redeemers struggle with this contradiction, usually by trying to adjust policy in response to events and with short-term goals in mind. They were a tad more thoughtful, though, and just as parsimonious, in adjusting the state debt and with state expenditures. That is, they thought a little more fully. But we see their lack of vision for the future in their agricultural policies, their industrial policies, their educational policies, and their social welfare policies. Where they really were farsighted, however, was in their penal system policies, where they instituted the cruel policy of convict lease in order to find a non-tax income stream for the state. The first 4 Bourbon governors implemented, for what it's worth, Redeemer policies, while the last 4 battled against the threat of populism. With this, I'll end the lecture. As always, thanks for your attention.